Here at the Paul Mellon Center. I know a lot of you have been here before, but a warm welcome to those of you joining for the first time, and also a warm welcome to everyone joining online. It is my pleasure today to welcome Matthew M. Reeve to give a talk here, and I'll just kind of outline what the rest of the evening will look like, and then introduce Matthew and hand over. So the talk will be about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, yeah. And then we'll have a short Q&A session, both for people in the room, and if you have questions online, feel free to put it in the chat. And then straight after, so we keep the Q&A quite short because we do have a reception right next door for those of us at the center. And that's really a way to continue conversations more informally, so there will be plenty of time for discussion. So Matthew M. Reeve is a professor of art history at Queen's University in Canada. So thank you for coming all the way to London. And he specializes in later medieval art in Northern Europe with a particular focus on Britain. Although he has had a long-standing interest in the history of architecture in general and the history of sexuality. So working on art in all media, he has published extended accounts of Salisbury and Wells cathedrals, art and architecture in the secular world, the historiography of medieval art, and the arts of Marian devotion, some of which we'll be hearing about today. He has also explored the afterlife of medieval art and ideas in the oeuvre of Horace Walpole and his companions, and the heritage of medievalist art and politics in Canadian art and architecture. So a very broad sweep of things. So his talk today is titled Hands That Heal, Looks That Kill, Towards a Fabulous History of Marian Architecture. Over to Matthew. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Very warm welcome. I should begin, of course, by thanking the Paul Mellon Center for supporting me and my work, and to thank them, of course, for this very kind invitation. It's really a delight and an honor to be here. It's also lovely to see many friends and colleagues in the audience, and in fact, even some former students, which is starting to show me my age, I have to say. And I should say that unlike many who speak about work already done in this venue, I'm going to be speaking about very much ongoing work tonight. So what I'm going to do here is going to be somewhat open-ended. And as I know that not everybody in the audience is a medievalist, I'm going to sort of back into this by starting not in the Middle Ages, but in modernity. And not in England, but in fact in the United States. The 2018 Metropolitan Museum, pardon me, in 2018, the Metropolitan Museum and the Met Cloisters in New York staged the remarkable Heavenly Bodies, Fashion and the Catholic Imagination show that displayed modern liturgical vestments by leading fashion houses against and aside medieval Catholic works of art. Typologically and functionally, all of the vestments had a medieval heritage, whether as liturgical garments or as garments made to dress medieval devotional statues, as in the case of Yves Saint Laurent's 1985 statuary vestment for the 13th century Virgin of El Rocío at the Chapelle Notre-Dame de Compassion in Paris. Modern critics in the New York Times variously condemned the show for its commodification and exploitation of faith, or they celebrated it for offering a sensual entry into the very aesthetics of Catholicism, a world in which beauty was itself a manifestation of the presence of God. The New York Times critic Jason Farago was clear that the Virgin Mary was the star of the show. Describing the cloister's installation, in which the Virgin gazes upon the crucified body of Christ, he states, and I quote him here at length, "It is here that you'll find, in the reconstructed Spanish chapel, the show's most famous ensemble. Balenciaga's 1967 wedding gown, made of silk the color of ice milk and topped with an architectonic hood in the place of a veil. Erroneously known as, quote-unquote, the one-seam wedding dress, this extraordinary garment appears to have been immaculately conceived rather than sewn." For the medievalist, Heavenly Bodies did a considerable amount of art historical work. The immaculate, glistening surfaces of these modern garments were juxtaposed with the surfaces of works of medieval art, such as the Montvianney and Morgan Madonnas that were damaged or whose polychromy had long been worn away or that were simply incomplete due to iconoclasm. But rather than diminishing medieval art by sheer contrast, and thus indulging in a rather sorry Vasarian trope of a dirty and debased Middle Ages, the show did something close to the opposite. By animating the neo-medieval setting of the Met cloisters with modern Catholic garments, Heavenly Bodies proposed a grand historiographical restitution, by which medieval art was seen again in context as fashionable and sensuous, an art created within a world defined by aesthetic, sexual, and religious hierarchies. Farrago's allusion to the aesthetics of the Virgin Mary as supernatural, literally the result of miracles, likewise engaged with medieval ideas. The Virgin was known to have miraculously created a range of seamless garments, from the garment that Christ wore and for which Roman soldiers would cast lots at the crucifixion, as in John 19, to the chasuble of Saint Ildefonsus, which was created by her so perfectly, and the text says literally seamlessly without seams, that one could not detect stitches at all, and to the impeccable body of Christ itself, the flesh of which was understood to have been fashioned from the loom of the Virgin's womb. Kind of a remarkable idea. But the show also hints at something larger that should be of little surprise to most of us here, and that is that the very aesthetics of medieval Catholic art anticipate and inform our modern discourses on fashion, spectacle, and beauty. Not unlike the stunning effect of modern fashion upon the viewer, the effect of the Virgin Mary and her images, and what I'm going to suggest here, her architecture, registered at the aesthetic level of the sublime. The beauty of the Virgin was intrinsic to what Stephen Yeager would call her charisma, and her effect on the viewer was that of enchantment. Like the art of the runway, Marian art tended to be an art form in the high style, both aesthetically and rhetorically. Mary's singular beauty, her suavitas singularis, was understood as the source for the kind of sensual delight that humankind once enjoyed in Eden, and her earthly representations were known to have a profound physical and intellectual effect on the medieval viewer. A visual shock so powerful that it could render them motionless and incapable of thought or speech. The 11th century Byzantine writer Michael Sellos describes the effect of gazing upon an icon of the Virgin and Child, and he says this: "It particularly ravishes me as a bolt of lightning. It strikes me with its beauty, depriving me of strength and reason." Much the same sentiment is echoed in a Marian collection in the British Library, which opens with a section entitled On Mary's Beauty and Name, which recounts that when St. Ignatius of Antioch first saw Mary, her beauty stunned him and he lost control of his body and fell to the ground. Of course, aesthetic response to the Virgin could be dangerous, frankly, and veer toward the sexual. One 12th century miracle story recounts that a knight in Coutances became enamored by the beauty of a statue of the Virgin and again lost control and fell down. And he would be then punished by Christ for thoughts that erroneously moved from admiration to objectification and to lust. Now, my talk tonight is, of course, about medieval architecture and not about modern fashion, and those of you who can see what I'm wearing will know that I know nothing about that. But I raise these issues at the outset because, with some notable exceptions, and there are some notable exceptions to be sure, critics have been, I think, insufficiently attentive to the aesthetic dimensions of Marian art, and much less still to its expression of a highly cultivated sense of glamour that defined the Queen of Heaven in the High Middle Ages. Marian buildings have been located within broader stylistic teleologies of medieval architectural history, which have tended to flatten or obscure their specific character. Studying them together, as I propose to do here, exposes continuities in terms of iconography and style, but also in terms of the very character of their dedicatee as expressed by them. And while it's often been noted that Marian spaces tended to be among the most lavishly ornamented and elegantly constructed spaces in great churches, the question remains, why was this so? And I'm going to try to approach this very question from different perspectives over the next 45 minutes or so. While Britain had a well-established cult of the Virgin in the Anglo-Saxon period, new impetus was given to her cult by at least two key movements. First, around 1100, a new tradition would interpret the Song of Songs from the Old Testament as a key text of Marian devotion, reading the amorous tale of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba as the mystical love shared between Christ and the Virgin. Scholars such as Honorius Augustodinensis and Rupert of Deutz offered rich commentaries that endowed the Virgin with a new range of associations. Of particular importance here was Solomonic imagery, in which Mary is the bride of Christ and the throne of wisdom, the Sedes Sapientiae. Her architectural settings evoked a number of possible Solomonic structures as architectural manifestations of wisdom itself. And I'm going to return to this point, by the way, several times in what follows. Responding to these texts, English monasticism imagined a new Marian art, with novel iconographies, including the Coronation of the Virgin, which first appeared in England around 1100 at Worcester and Reading. And second, the first Latin collections of Marian miracles began to appear in the first half of the 12th century in England, and these collections would be expanded throughout the Middle Ages by John of Garland, Vincent of Beauvais, and in Alfonso X's Cantigas de Santa Maria. And while I can only mention it here, and I'm really doing this largely because I love this image, the Book of Hours as a new category of illuminated book was born in Oxford around 1240, which centered the devotee, of course, upon the life of the Virgin and her miracles. And what I'm showing you here is really the prehistory of the Faustian legend, in which Theophilus sells his soul to the devil, only to have it returned by the Virgin in the De Brail's Hours. And it was thus no surprise that by 1350 or so, the end of my story tonight, England was called the Virgin's Dowry, or the Dowry of Mary. Now, my interest in Marian art began as an offshoot of my work on the sculpture of Wells Cathedral, which I'm hoping will soon be a book. When I returned to the west facade, I began by reconstructing the central image of the Coronation of the Virgin, something that had been sorely lacking in all previous accounts. The series of holes around the figural group and the extant paint traces allowed for a reconstruction with a series of gilt stars that studded the background, thus articulating, amongst other things, Mary's role as the Stella Maris, or the Star of the Sea. The stars, actually star I show you here, there are others of them, are from nearby Glastonbury Abbey, and we'll come back to those soon. But for now, this unprecedented multimedia composition was as unprecedented as the facade itself. The dominant trope of the facade is from commentaries on the Song of Songs, which describe heaven as a great wall or cliff face populated with the saints of heaven and Christ and the Virgin at the center. And as I've shown elsewhere, this is described most fully in the contemporary commentary on the Song of Songs by the Englishman William of Newburgh. Offering a single image of the court of heaven witnessing the coronation of the Virgin, the facade was an influential statement of the potentialities of Marian art. The central tympanum prefaced the great apse mosaic at Santa Maria Maggiore, while the overall image of the court of heaven, gazing upon the coronation of the Virgin, preceded what is often understood as the first example of this iconography, Giotto's Baroncelli Polyptych, by about a century or so. But to keep things somewhat focused here, I will restrict myself to one of the supreme products of Marian devotion, the Lady Chapel in English architecture. While many chapels dedicated to the Virgin existed within Anglo-Saxon and Romanesque churches, the independent Lady Chapel, attached to the north, south, or west ends of great churches, as at Glastonbury and Bury St Edmunds, for instance, or built as an extension to its east end, as at Worcester, formed a new architectural type in the 12th century. Liturgically speaking, these structures were required by the increasingly elaborate liturgical rite of the Virgin Mary that included, among other things, a daily sung Marian Mass, celebrating the new liturgical feast of the Conception of the Virgin, and the elaborate new devotions to the Virgin codified in the English use of Sarum. Lady Chapels represent a new physical and allegorical space for the Virgin within England's great churches. Better yet, I think, her home, or maybe even her court, and I'll come back to that a couple of times in what follows. Now, to explain my rather camp title, and I know it is, no apologies for that, I use the word fabulous here in two senses. First, to comment on the remarkable elegance of these buildings, their technical sophistication, and their cutting-edge nature in terms of form and style. And I know I must say that this making this claim might seem rather dubious given the material record. The fact that Marian, you can laugh at that, that's okay. The fact that Marian art was a particular focus for dissolution iconoclasm means that Marian spaces, where they still exist, are devoid of much of their imagery and polychromy, and all of them require careful work to reconstitute them, as we're going to see. Second, I use fabulous here to illustrate that the making and interpretation of Marian art was frequently informed by fabula, or stories. Some of our most significant buildings dedicated to or featuring the Virgin were informed by literary narratives, and particularly Marian miracles, in which the Virgin ordered a building to be built, intervened in its construction, or even just built it herself. So in this talk, in other words, I'll be telling one story based upon many. But let me begin by offering some more general observations on Marian art. Consider the well-known miracle story, The Gambler of Châteauroux. In this miracle, a woman enters a monastery to pray to a beautiful statue of the Virgin. A gambler rebuked her, stating that, and I quote, "Those who believe in stone images are greatly deceived," and he threw a stone at what he called the painted idols to prove that they are merely representations. The stone breaks the arm of the Christ child, and the statue of the Virgin becomes instantly animated and grabs the arm before it can fall, but drops the flower she held as a result, essentially fracturing her image. Christ's wound gushed with blood, and the Virgin's golden garments slipped down below her breasts, revealing them naked. And the stunning beauty of Mary's body then arrested her assailants. The Virgin's eyes, and by the way, I love this quotation, the Virgin's eyes narrowed so fiercely that none dared to look upon her. The Virgin then exacts her revenge by killing the gambler who offended the statue, and then, of course, his entire entourage. Fair enough. The gambler then makes three errors, it might be said, in addressing the statue. First, he sees it as an inert representation, rather than an image embodied by the Virgin. Second, he misinterprets the Virgin's sacred image as a pagan idol. And third, he fractured the decorously poised image when he causes her robe to slip and reveal her naked body. Erudite readers would have known that this narrative was informed by an ancient literary topos, in which female nudity literally suspends a male viewer. The ultimate source is probably the reunion of Menelaus and Helen of Troy on the eve of the sack of Troy, when, as Menelaus advances to murder his spouse, her rent garments fall to expose her breasts, and the shock of her naked beauty paralyzes his sword hand, thus saving her life. Whatever the source, and it's really not material right now, it is clear that Marian miracles offer a highly codified set of criteria for looking at, interpreting, and engaging with the Virgin's artistic representations, thus endorsing, I think, Alexa Sand's brilliant view that Marian miracles may have helped to theorize the very idea of art in the Middle Ages, and frankly, I think she's dead right about that. In her miracles, the Virgin is not only a singularly beautiful woman, but she also possesses exquisite aesthetic judgment and a keenly honed sense of the beautiful as it pertains to art and architecture. Her awareness of the technical aspects of art, of superlative craftsmanship, and of the decorum befitting the Queen of Heaven are regular refrains in her miracles. In the 12th century Book of the Miracles of the Virgin, Boto of Proofning records that a new cycle of paintings had been painted in the chapel there. While asleep, Boto had a vision in which he, and I quote, "He saw the glorious Virgin walking here and there, carefully examining the pictures, and with a cheerful countenance thanking the assembly for the expense of such venerable service." End quote. Here, the Virgin walks along the walls of the chapel, gazing upon the paintings and giving them her approval, much in the fashion of a latter-day art critic or connoisseur. Mary also emerges as a figure who has carefully and decisively curated her own representations and their architectural settings. Consider the miracle of the monk artist Tuatilo and his making of a Marian image from Metz. While he was carving a statue of the Virgin Mary, 2 pilgrims came in begging alms. When they left, the visitors asked, and this is a quotation, "Who was that man's sister? The lady of wondrous beauty, who was so helpful as to hand him his chisels and to even teach him how to use them." End quote. Now, Tuatilo, however, was completely unaware that the Virgin had been guiding his hand. And of course, a monk, he fled to the city to avoid accusations of having a girl in his room, a woman in his cell. It was the Virgin Mary who finished the image and added an inscription that says, by translation, "This holy object was carved by Holy Mary herself." It has recently been suggested that this miracle, or a related one, informs the frontispiece of the Lambeth Apocalypse, in which a monk artist delicately paints a statue of the Virgin and Child, and the Virgin leans into the artist to thank him with the apple she holds in her hand. Now, as this suggests, Mary emerges not only as a maker of art and architecture, but as a figure with a highly elevated and indeed superior aesthetic judgment. She possessed and promoted, in other words, a cultivated and even courtly sense of the configuration, material character, and content of art. She viciously punished those who misunderstood or disrespected her images or buildings, and generously rewarded those who understood and paid them the deference that she demanded. For the art historian, it might be said, the Virgin Mary is good to think with. But the same, I think, can be said for the historian of architecture. A lengthy tradition allegorized Mary either as a building herself or as a designer and maker of buildings. The early 13th century Salve Regina offers a catalog of possible Marian allegories, which suggests that she is, and I'm quoting here, the tabernacle of God, the temple, the house, the entry hall, the bedchamber, the Ark of the Covenant, the Gate of Ezekiel, the City of God, the Star of the Sea, the court, the tower, the castle, and so forth and so on. But such allegories were not superficial. Indeed, they informed a tradition of exegetical thought that implicated the Virgin with the built environment. And so, of course, did Marian miracles, in which the Virgin miraculously intervenes to ensure that churches dedicated to her were built, corrected, and decorated appropriately to her honor. The Cantigas de Santa Maria, for example, recounts the creation of a Marian altar in 12th century Constantinople, created from marble brought from abroad. As the marble was sawn, the image of the Virgin and Child miraculously appeared within the marble veining, thus endorsing such superlative technologies through the gift of a miraculous image by the Virgin herself. Now, to turn finally to Britain and to the Lady Chapel, I'm introducing here 2 Marian building miracles, each from East Anglia and relating to known Marian cults. Our first story is the circa 1460 Pinson Ballad, which recounts the creation of the new Lady Chapel, the Holy House at Walsingham, by Richildis de Faverges, apparently in 1061, although it is generally believed to have been more like 1130 or so. Unfortunately, Walsingham was largely flattened at the dissolution, but the literary and archaeological evidence and some recent reconstruction work allows some insights into this important building. The Pinson Ballad records that Richildis wished to create a site for devotion to the Virgin, so she prayed to Mary, who visited her in the vision 3 times, each time taking her to the site of the Annunciation in Nazareth, the Holy House, as a model for what would be built in Walsingham. Richildis was careful to take account of the sacred mensuration of the building, its measurements, and to ensure that Walsingham was built with exactly these proportions. And then, of course, she summoned her builders. A further miracle followed, which dictated the original site for the chapel. Before building, quote-unquote, silver dew sent from heaven fell upon the ground, but left dry a perfect footprint of the building to be built, thus defining its shape and location. Work then began, but the masons floundered under a lack of skill and a poor understanding of geometry and mathematics, and could not, as the poem tells us, properly join together the building's component parts. Understanding that her builders were not up to the task, the Virgin, and it says here in the poem, herself being the chief artificer, essentially fired her builders and miraculously constructed the chapel herself overnight with angels' hands. When the workmen awoke, to find the site of a finished chapel, they found each part, and this is a quotation, they found each part joined together flawlessly, better than they could have ever imagined. So, like the textiles created by the Virgin with which I began, the building was literally more finely built than any they had ever seen. Conceived by the Virgin alone, the Holy House was from a privileged category of cult object, like the Hodegatria or the Veronica, namely an acheropoeton, a work created by divine rather than by human hands. Many of the topoi in the Pinson Ballad had a history in miraculous and particularly Marian building. The miraculous falling of dew and frost to mark out a building can be noted, for example, at Santa Maria Maggiore, where the miracle of falling snow marked out the ground plan for the basilica in the 13th century Book of the Miracles of the Virgin, as Lucy Donkin has shown in a really wonderful essay. Both the Pinson Ballad and the Santa Maria Maggiore miracles reference the account of Gideon's fleece in Judges 6, in which Gideon asks God to give him a sign that he will help him save Israel. He then casts his fleece on the floor and asks that in the morning, if God anoint the fleece rather than the floor with dew, he will know that he has God's support. Gideon's fleece is a careful allusion here, as a long tradition of Marian exegesis indicated that, like the fleece, Mary also accepted the dew of heaven in the inception of the Holy Spirit. We now know, by the way, that the Holy House at Walsingham was conceived in two main phases. The initial 12th century structure was built in wood, which can only be due to a perception of the Holy House at Nazareth as a humble sylvan dwelling. The second phase took place in the second half of the 15th century, when the Holy House was encased within a larger stone building, as you see it here. And thanks to David Robinson, by the way, who's here tonight, for his help with this. At this point, the original Holy House became itself a relic, enshrined within a modern structure built to house it. And in this, its closest sibling is surely the Holy House in Loreto, which was apparently miraculously airlifted by angels from Nazareth to Italy in the 1290s after the fall of Acre in 1291. The second miracle occurred at the Cluniac Priory of St. Mary, Thetford. The miracles there, now at Corpus Christi College, were productions of a Marian cult that began in the first half of the 13th century in response to Walsingham, when the main subject of their narratives, the New Lady Chapel, as I show it to you here, was built. In the narrative, a humble builder, and he's called in the text a simplex operarius, prays to the Virgin to recover his health. And she asks him, in return, to appeal to the prior of Thetford to build a new chapel in her honor. The prior proposes construction in wood, but the mason retorts that the Virgin demanded a chapel in more elevated material of stone. After all, this was a Marian chapel and not the Holy House. Then followed the miraculous appearance of a jeweled cross that appeared to mark the Virgin's intended site for the Lady Chapel. So, in other words, having shown where and out of what her new chapel was to be built, the monks of Thetford followed suit. From these texts, we glean some dominant ideas of Marian architecture. First, it could be built by the Virgin or due to her direct intervention, and it follows that it could be understood to be endowed with the divine artistry of the Virgin herself. Second, size and proportion mattered. The Virgin also complained that her buildings were too small, and she was not above dictating their size and orientation with measuring rods, dew, and stones. That the Virgin possessed such knowledge was natural to the medieval devotee, who understood her to be the patron saint of scholars and the mistress of the 7 liberal arts, which of course included geometry and mathematics. Third, these narratives emblematize material upgrades, as lower categories of material, in other words wood, is upgraded to stone, stone is upgraded to marble, or faded statues are updated or refreshed with new paint and other materials. The Madonna, in other words, was very much a material girl. I'm sorry to everyone, by the way, who was alive in the 1980s for that comment. Now, the Lady Chapel at Glastonbury was unique in English architecture, but it nonetheless inspired progeny. The Lady Chapel at Glastonbury was built from 1184 after a devastating fire leveled the Vetusta Ecclesia, or the ancient church on site. The Vetusta Ecclesia was a wattled church dedicated to the Virgin, which Glastonbury legend ascribed to Joseph of Arimathea and 12 disciples in the 1st century AD. This original church was apparently built at the request of the Virgin, who sent Gabriel to appear in a vision to Joseph's followers to erect the church in her honor. Joseph would also be responsible for making the original Marian image, which was untouched by fire or smoke in the 1184 fire and was thus miraculously saved. Understood in the terms of this heady of fictive history, our chapel and its Marian images become substitutions, modern iterations of sacred originals. Indeed, the 15th century life of Joseph describes the 12th century chapel as literally the same church as the wooden Vetusta Ecclesia. At the center of the Marian cult, the chapel was originally conceived as a rectangular structure built in 4 bays. The chapel's historicity was reflected in its retrospective character, with chevron moldings, round-headed arches, and so forth. Retrospective though aspects were, the chapel was among the most lavish interiors from 12th century Europe. The interior was articulated by structural polychromy in blue lias and some Purbeck marble, and it was richly painted throughout, with a high dado wall, with stars, moons, and as I hope you can see it there, populated down below all the way around by a host of saints, all of which appeared around essentially to the central altar of Mary. But the interior was also once studded with the lead gilt stars I showed earlier, placed in regular intervals on the dado spandrels, thus endowing it with dazzling metal accents which amplified the Virgin's status as the Stella Maris, or the Star of the Sea. More importantly, I think, such elaboration amplified the language of Marian devotion in Ceramuse, in which Mary resides, and I quote here, "Mary resides with the heavenly court, in the star-spangled palaces of heaven." And that's essentially exactly what I think we see in front of us. The overtly courtly nature of the Virgin's part of the chapel's interior, featuring the Queen of Heaven surrounded by her court of saints in the dado, is in no sense accidental. Indeed, it agrees with the form of the chapel itself, which, it's been pointed out elsewhere, is based as much in the architecture of the saintly chapel as in the forms of the rectangular secular hall. Informing this typology, I suggest, was a long-standing trope in medieval Mariology, in which the Virgin is the hall, or aula, the virginal hall, the aula virginis, or the royal hall, the aula regia, the royal hall, in other words, in which Christ was nurtured. In the 4th century, St. Ambrose notes that when Christ sought to find a palace in which to live for redeeming mankind, no small feat, he did not look for stones or wood worked by human hands, but instead chose the virginal womb of Mary to make it his royal palace, the Aula Regia. In the 12th century, Peter of Celle, Bishop of Chartres, wrote an Advent sermon in which Mary is described as the palace built with wonderful efforts. Now, I could go on and on and on about that very point, but it will suffice to state that these ideas inform the choice of an overtly hall-like form for the Lady Chapel at Glastonbury and a range of subsequent examples. But the key thing to glean here is the nature of signification. While Glastonbury and many other chapels were made specific references to the Virgin or her miracles in their imagery, within the largely non-representational sphere of architecture, structure and ornament synthesize to express a form of Marian embodiment. Their beauty, material complexity, and sophistication, in other words, offered a structure that evoked this architectural setting of the Virgin's heavenly court in the mind of devotees. And in thinking about this, I follow Christian Freigang, who borrows from classical rhetoric to describe imitatio in Gothic buildings. Operating in the mode of the imitatio morum, architecture and ornamentation was structured to express the dominant tropes and to amplify the very significations of its dedicatee in a manner not necessarily tethered at all to iconography or style. Now, Glastonbury would influence another important West Country example, the early 13th century Lady Chapel at St. Augustine's in Bristol. The chapel clearly reflects Glastonbury being built in 4 bays with a vault and a carved dado with spandrels. A letter, fortunately, exists that describes its construction, from Abbot David of Bristol to the Dean of Wells Cathedral around 1220. And this is what it says. I'll just show it to you here on the screen. It says, "We most devoutly beg of your generosity for your servant L to hew out the 7 pillars of the house of wisdom, that is to say, of the glorious Virgin." Scholars have tended to take this letter literally and note that it requests to borrow a master from Wells to erect a lady chapel in nearby Bristol, and there's simply no reason to doubt that that's the case. The style is very close. But more significant for my purposes is the language of the letter, which cites Proverbs 9:1. "Wisdom has built her house, she has set up its 7 pillars." Now, Proverbs was understood in the Middle Ages to have been authored by the wise King Solomon, so the Marian adaptation of the text fit into an understanding of the Virgin as the embodiment of wisdom. Referencing Proverbs 9:1, the 7 columns would be allegorized as the 7 liberal arts, governed by the Virgin by Albertus Magnus and others, and yet still more people would write upon the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, and so forth and so on. But it's significant that Proverbs 9:1 also informs the hall-like nature of the early Lady Chapel. Peter Damian, for example, could describe the Virgin as, and I quote him, "the beautiful royal palace of the heavenly king, supported by 7 columns of wisdom." The abbot's letter, however, puts a different and rather specifically Marian spin on this tradition by considering wisdom not to be Christ, but the Virgin Mary, and the house or hall not to be the Virgin's womb or body, but her own Lady Chapel. Much the same interpretation of Proverbs 9:1 would inform the Parisian Bible Moralisée. On the folio that is entitled Sapience, or Wisdom, the first roundel opens with Proverbs 9:1, with the Virgin building her temple with 7 columns. Here, the Virgin directs her mason much in the guise of an elite metropolitan architect who works with her intellectual faculties through ordination and disposition rather than by hand. And as significant is what Proverbs tells us about how the space of the chapel was conceived. Excuse me one second. In Proverbs 9, wisdom offers a social meal in order to advise her guests on wisdom itself in issues of conduct, comportment, and ethics. Understood within the space of the chapel, there is a straightforward allegory here of the Mass, in which the Virgin was positioned at the high altar, and the devotees are her subjects. Positioned around the chapel in the spandrels were the subjects of wisdom's discourse. Consider the spandrel with images of animal musicians, itself a sign of bestial behavior and chaos as animals take over the liturgy of the church. Or the image of a man battling a beast, with Reynard the fox below, who steals the cock and runs off. A reminder of vigilance in the everyday life of the Christian soul. Offering a range of admonitions in sculpted form, these reflect plastic versions of Mary's wisdom, thus completing the overall trope of the chapel interior. The Lady Chapels at Glastonbury and Bristol seem to have suggested a common iconographic type in England. The dado arcade with spandrels above and saints below at Glastonbury was replicated at Worcester Cathedral, where the Eastern Lady Chapel and choir extension featured a rich painted accompaniment of saints down below. They're now barely visible, which must have suggested the same heavenly court surrounding the altar of the Virgin. And I hope that you can just see them, the kind of halos and so forth down here below with figures that were in those spaces. They will need a lot of work to try to work out what they may have been. And although heavily restored, we can glean some sense of the sculpture, which featured Marian themes, animals, and seemingly one or more Marian miracles. A similar arrangement must have informed the first Lady Chapel at Wells Cathedral, the Lady Chapel Juxta Claustrum, or by the cloister, which was built probably around 1250 or 1260. While the Lady Chapel was lost in the 15th century, the archaeology of the surviving spandrels allow for a reliable reconstruction. We have now a collection of 23 figural spandrels that belong to the 13th century and would have formed an arcade very similar to that at Bristol. So in other words, something rather like this. The figural spandrels are remarkable survivals of 13th century British art, and yet they're very, very little known. Featuring animals from the bestiary, Marian miracles, images of the life of Christ and the Virgin, they are very closely related in iconography and style to those at Bristol. Some sense of the diversity of the imagery is suggested here. An image of animals enacting the liturgy, which we can compare to the death of Reynard the Fox in Walter's 102, and an image of an armed knight with a cross on his shield and carrying a pennon charging into a fortified city. Now, this figure has generally been identified as St. George or as the entry into Jerusalem, but it is, I think, far more likely to be St. Mercurius, a central figure in Marian miracle collections. In the story, Mercurius, a 3rd century soldier and martyr, is entombed in Caesarea. When Caesarea came under threat from Julian the Apostate, St. Basil prayed to the Virgin Mary for protection. Basil then had a vision in which the Virgin resurrects St. Mercurius and gives him his arms with a red cross on a white field, as you see it here, and his spear, and instructs him to slay Julian and save the city. Basil then visits the site of Mercurius's burial to see that his arms are missing, only to find them reappear the next day covered in the blood of battle. So, if this is correct, Wells is contemporary with what appears to be the first appearance of Mercurius in British art in the contemporary Lambeth Apocalypse. Mercurius may have been new at Wells, but his iconography would appear in the Lady Chapels at Peterborough and Ely, thus suggesting a developing canon of imagery. And it is to Ely and the 14th century that I turn in the final moments of this talk. The Lady Chapel at Ely was built between 1321 and 49, and it has the largest and best preserved, it is the largest and best preserved of our chapels. Although now devoid of much of its glass and figural sculpture, it clearly continued the tradition of figural spandrels and sculpture that I have been drawing out here. But here, it purges allegorical imagery of animals and so forth, and offers instead a cleaner, purer, more literal, if extended account of the life of the Virgin at the western end of the chapel, and a series of her miracles at the east. As Paul Binsky has argued in a brilliant analysis, which frankly I really can't add much to, the Lady Chapel was the end product of an intensive process of thought on Marian signification. Its plan is essentially a 2-to-1 length-to-width proportional scheme, which is best understood as an allusion to the Hall of Solomon, as it is described in 1 Kings 7, which records, and I quote, "He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, and its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Its west facade also had Solomonic allusions. Looking to the top of the facade, note the septet of now empty niches, which allude to the 6 steps of the throne of Solomon, the standard form of this iconography in the Gothic period, as we've seen. The Ely Chapel is rightly understood as a key monument of the English decorated style. Its ornament is defined by tightly structured combinations of the sinuous, nodding ogee arch that projects into the space of the chapel, elaborate foliage, and hundreds of large and small-scale figural sculptures. It has been pointed out elsewhere that the earliest appearance of the ogee arch was in monuments created for the Virgin Mary, or occasionally for female patrons in general, leading to the question of whether the arch was imagined as a form of architecture conducive to the Virgin Mary herself. And Ely's contemporary, and my final example, is the porch of St. Mary Redcliffe in Bristol. The porch was built around 1320 onto an existing one-bay porch of 1220. Although a main point of entry, the porch is documented as the principal Lady Chapel at Redcliffe, and it would contain a Marian devotional image. Built around a hexagon, the 14th century porch was a centrally planned, vaulted structure, and absolutely just a fantastic building, frankly. As Krautheimer showed so long ago, medieval centrally planned structures frequently bore Marian dedications, leading back ultimately to the Pantheon in Rome, or the Sancta Maria Rotunda, as it was known in the Middle Ages. The hexagonal form of the porch was all but unique, as was its pyrotechnic ornamentation. As at Ely, the technologies of the decorated style, defined here by the ogee arch and the crocketed gable, are marshaled to create an arresting spectacle. The curvilinearity in these buildings may well have been employed to suggest a particularly feminine mode of Gothic appropriate to the Virgin's heavenly court. This voluptuous language of insinuation, those are Paul's words, by the way, they're not mine, I wish they were mine, suggests subtle amplifications of pre-existing Gothic forms, which may, via their technical sophistication and their sheer visual beauty, have served to signify the essence of the Virgin in material form. But also, like Ely, Redcliffe was constructed to make a range of conscious allusions to Solomonic prototypes. As Helen Lennon has pointed out recently in your own British art studies, the deliberate layering of architecture at Bristol with one porch built upon another also alludes to Solomon's house in 1 Kings, and to its porch in particular, which was also built in 2 phases. The key source here for this is 1 Kings 7, and it says, "And he made a porch of pillars of 50 cubits in length and 30 cubits in breadth, and another porch before a greater porch." We thus witness here a brilliant and careful allusion to a hallowed Marian or Solomonic prototype. As significant, I think, is the fact that the underlying geometry of the porch may be a hexagram or a 6-pointed star, which was known as the seal of Solomon in the later Middle Ages. Given by God to Solomon to allow him to control demons, the seal was readily translated to a Marian emblem, since the Virgin likewise controls and suppresses demons in many of her miracles. The Seal of Solomon, in fact, had rather a long history in Marian representation, from the Cantigas de Santa Maria to an image in an English book of hours, as I show it to you here, that protected its owner when in battle, and to a pilgrimage badge from nearby Glastonbury Abbey. We may thus understand that the Virgin's porch had an apotropaic function encoded in its very design. This important building was imagined as a catalogue of dominant Solomonic imagery as it pertained to the Virgin Mary. And in this, it would seem to reflect a new literalism in terms of quotation to biblical prototypes, and a new density in terms of signification, by which Marian tropes became synthesized and compressed into a single structure. Now, it's been possible here to discuss really only the smallest part of the very vast project on the cult of the Virgin in British Gothic art. Discussing Marian buildings outside of the conventional stylistic teleologies that generally frame them is, I admit, dangerous, but it helps to illustrate a developing tradition with its own coherent logic, its system of images, much of which, I hasten to add, still requires exploration. Of course, the destruction of these spaces at the dissolution means that our understanding of the Virgin's cult will remain, at best, partial. But this is not because these spaces were ineffective or opaque to medieval audiences, but in fact the exact opposite. Early modern critiques of medieval Marian imagery targeted the very factors that endorsed their creation in the first place. The use of aristocratic garments, golden crowns, and so forth to dress statues, literally the trappings of the elite court, were decried as, and I quote, shameless beauty and worldly splendor. From one perspective, at least, I can only imagine that the High Gothic Virgin would have been delighted. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. This was just really exciting for me, not being a medievalist as well. I know we'll have questions in the room and questions in the audience from our online audiences as well. If you do put it in the Q&A section, it actually comes miraculously to my phone, and I can read it out to Matthew. So, any specific? Maybe I can start with some. But I have a couple of things that I was thinking about. I think the first one is what really grabs me as a non-medievalist, especially, is this idea of the Virgin Mary as an agent in the sense of somewhere that the conception of design is happening, not so much the labor of design. Yes, I think I was kind of trying to figure out what the relationship was between the kind of where the idea is coming from and the material and the materiality of the building of it, and kind of what happens in that space in between, and how that's talked about potentially, and what you're kind of how you're thinking with that space in between as well.
Is this on? Yes, it is. Okay. It's a great question, because in certain miracles, of course, we have the situation that it says, of course, that she built something with angels' hands, almost as though she summoned angels to do it. But in other cases, of course, in terms of textiles, these are things that she makes very much by herself. So there is a degree of slippage in terms of that. Certain things will be built by her and certain things won't. And I think it's a little too early to say exactly where the lines are. But it does seem, frankly, there's a vast amount of textile work done by the Virgin Mary. So there is, in that sense, a kind of a leaning toward what we take to be a kind of a more, I don't know, female form of art making, at least in the Middle Ages, that she actually takes on. But that may actually prove out to be wrong as I go through it.
Oh, thank you. I'm looking around. Yeah.
Thanks, Matthew. That was really fabulous. And I had so two questions. One is about chapter houses as Marian spaces. I guess this is a quick one. Like, does your kind of, and if we think about Westminster chapter house as being this kind of Marian space, and then it's imitated, does pretty much what you're arguing here, do you think that maps onto those kinds of spaces? And the second question, which I don't really have an answer to, or anyway, I was trying to think about what happens to Lady Chapels kind of after the 14th century, their kind of big heyday. And, you know, if we think about the cult of the Virgin kind of continues to flourish into the 15th, 16th century, how do we think about that architecturally? And I mean, the one example I could think of was really the Lady Chapel at Westminster, as in the Henry VII chapel, which is definitely very fabulous. And I just wondered if you could speak about, I guess, the kind of afterlife of this phenomenon beyond the 14th century.
Okay, well, chapter houses first. Chapter houses, of course, as you know well, really articulate, in a sense, the authority of the chapter. And while they may have, you know, as you say, kind of Marian significations and so forth, I think they are something really about sort of corporate identity, more so than the Virgin Mary in that particular context. That's certainly my read on them. Although I take your point entirely, there is a degree of exchange between them. In terms of later things, I mean, what's very interesting about this, of course, is that much of our most interesting evidence for the Virgin Mary comes very, very late. So as you say, there's a tremendous flourishing of interest in the Virgin Mary in the later 15th century, right up to the dissolution. So that is a very, very key point that really needs an awful lot of work, because the sheer amount of text and so forth is vast. But that is exactly right. That does seem to be, after the Black Death, a vast flourishing of interest in the cult. That's, in a sense, a very separate project. I mean, I propose here, what really interested me in thinking about this was really trying to create a genealogy for Ely, because it's always stood as a very one-off building. And I never really thought, I mean, it is an extraordinary and singular structure, to be sure, no question, but it has a genealogy. There is actually a series of ideas that lead up to it. And that's really what I wanted to kind of flesh out, as much as aspects of the miraculous nature of building and so forth, which really don't come in much into medieval architectural history. You know, in a certain sense, I think that the language of academic discourse, its inherent faux objectivity. There's nothing objective about what we write, let's be honest. It's all very subjective, but we pretend that it is, of course. And so in that sense, it's very difficult to deal with miraculous within our own language, you know. So that is one of the things that we need to think about as scholars in terms of really trying to make sense of these things. I hope I've answered your question. That was kind of a rambling reply, but.
Thanks very much. That was a fascinating talk.
There.
Here I am, sorry. Putting things together. And I think this is really, you've touched on it in answering the last questions, but how does the building of the Lady Chapels map in with the rest of the cult of the Virgin? You know, the theology and the hymns and so forth.
Relatively closely, I think. There is a wonderful new 2-volume set of the Marian devotions by John Harper in Sarah Muse, which goes to that very, very carefully. So one can now, I mean, we always could do this, of course, but now he's redone the actual text with translations and so forth. So they're very much accessible within an actual architectural context. Having said that, however, in terms of documentation, this is a very good question because, of course, you know, most great churches had more than one space where the Virgin was celebrated, but it's really only in a couple of places, particularly Westminster Abbey, where we have a documentary record that is sufficient to really understand this. And it's actually a wonderful essay by Barbara Harvey that goes into that in really, really tremendous detail. But as you say, that's extremely rare where we have that much evidence for one building. And ironically, of course, that very building was lost long ago. We have its footprint. We know what that looked like. But the building itself is very much lost. But we can actually deal with candles and altars and so forth in that space. But beyond that, it really is very much a case-by-case account of trying to reconstruct what we can. I'm not sure there's a great deal of generalizations one wants to make now. It is something to do, I think, on a kind of a microhistory level.
We have a couple of questions from our online audiences.
Oh, please, yeah.
And so the first one, great question, is it possible to say anything about the reception of these images and structures, i.e. did they have the intended resonances with their audiences? Do you want me to do all of them?
No.
Okay.
No, please don't. One at a time is fine. In terms of their reception, we do have a number of accounts that actually allow us to do this. I just earlier today, I was in the British Library, and there's a wonderful miracle that's, I think, just about totally unknown that takes place in the Westminster Lady Chapel. So we do have a series of accounts that allow you to do that, but I mean, it's very, very hard to do. You're hunting and pecking for certain things, of course, but in cases like that, one can actually find certain very pointed accounts of architecture in that respect. So.
Great. And the next one is about, well, it says, very interesting, thank you, etc. Are you aware of the work of the geometer Tom Bree, who has done extensive work on the sacred geometry and spiritual meaning of Wells Cathedral, especially in terms of the Virgin? Just yes or no is fine.
No, I'm not. To be honest, simply I'm not. So I wish I was. Would you please email me and tell me all about it? So.
Thank you. And then the last question is for now. Did the myth and tales of Boudica, the great warrior queen, have any influence on the strength of the Marian cult in medieval England?
Wow. That came from left field. Not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of. I will be happy to be wrong about that, but not that I'm aware of, no.
I think there's a question at the back.
It's just for the online audience. Thank you. You just alluded to a miracle in the Lady Chapel at Westminster.
Yes.
When and what?
Oh, it's really interesting. I've just transcribed it, so I'm happy to send it to you at some point. But it essentially says that there's a statue, and a woman and her child go in, and they use water to wash the feet of it, and the water itself actually heals the young child. But it gives us a little bit of topographical information about the chapel itself, which is what was more interesting to me about it. So.
When?
Early 13th century. Yeah. Speak to me afterward. I'm happy to give you the reference. No problem.
If are there any more? Yeah, Gervais.
Thanks, Matthew. Thank you very much. I wondered if you'd like to say anything at all about competition. You presented all these as universally reflecting an enthusiasm for the Virgin Mary, but there's also a competitive aspect, isn't there? Come here to this place and not to those other places.
Oh, absolutely. No, very much.
The badge there is just one hint in that direction. I just wondered if that was something you'd reflected on at all in terms of design in terms of building, competitive building?
Absolutely. And frankly, thanks largely to you and your work, which raises that lovely point. And I mean, in places like Thetford and so forth, in East Anglia, we have a whole series of Marian cults that spring up rather quickly, essentially in competition with Walsingham. And it's been pointed out by Nicholas Vincent and many other people that really Walsingham is a kind of a fluke in a sense, because it really comes down to royal interest. Henry III goes there a number of times, spends a lot of time and money there. And that, I think, is the inspiration for a lot of places, including Thetford, to develop and promote large Marian cults. But I think, royal sanction is an incredibly important thing in this time, obviously, So that is certainly one way in which this happens. The relationship of Thetford to other buildings, Thetford's, of course, as you can see, ruinous. So it's very hard to read its ornamentation in that sense. Nonetheless, it really has the same kind of size and scale of places like Peterborough and so forth. So one can certainly, in terms of ground plans and size, get a real sense for a kind of a size race, so to speak, in chapels in that period up until about 1350. And Ely, of course, I think rather takes the cake in the years just before the Black Death, of course, which is kind of interesting to see that as something which actually marks the temper, not the end, but the sort of the cessation, at least the brief cessation of interest until it picks up again, as we've seen later on. So that'll be a kind of a second chapter, I suppose.
So maybe sort of related question, which asks if you can elaborate on the legend of the House of Loreto, and were the houses of Nazareth built in England as rivals to the Italian original?
Oh, yeah. There are a couple. There's one at Glastonbury and one down deep in the West Country in Devon. I've actually forgotten where it is right now. But there are a couple. Whether they were meant to be in terms of competition with Loreto, I rather suspect not. Those are kind of far-flung places. I think it was more like going to our own Loreto here in England in that sense. I'm not sure they're actually competition. But really, of course, Glastonbury and Walsingham really remain the dominant cults. So they're really the very, very important ones, I think, in this case. But obviously, how many times can a building be airlifted? This is kind of a semantic problem, so that's something to think about too.
Well, a very big thank you. I know we probably have questions and discussions still sort of lingering in the room, and we can have them next door with a glass of something. So thanks again to Matthew.
Thank you.